Phillip. So this is another writing notes video as part of my teaching strategies series. And today we're going to talk about an activity that I've done several times that works really, really well for building students' audience awareness. And that is having students create profiles of their fellow students. So, this is actually something you can do really well both in the classroom and online. This semester I had my business writing students do this as a discussion forum post. But essentially what you're asking students to do is to think about a typical student at their university. So in my case, what's a typical Penn State student look like? Or what's an average Penn State student look like? And I ask students basically to think about three things. So first off, what are the characteristics of an average Penn State student? What does an average Penn State student look like? What do students generally have in common? Second, what are the concerns, values, beliefs of Penn State students in general? What do Penn State students in general think is important? And I typically ask students to come up with three things Penn State students believe in, or students at the university, whatever it is, whatever university you're at, or high school, whatever you want to do, go for it. So what are three values that your fellow students typically hold? And then the last thing that I ask students to think about is what rhetorical techniques would likely be effective at persuading your fellow students. So this may be what kinds of rhetorical appeals, this may be what kinds of references would students recognize. So at Penn State, students would likely recognize the "We Are" chant, they would recognize "Blue and White," the Nittany Lion, etc., etc. So what are the kinds of things that you, as a writer, could draw on to persuade this particular audience? So you have students make these lists, the characteristics of this audience, the values of this audience, the rhetorical needs, appeals, needs, values, etc., etc. And this is a useful exercise for having students think systematically about audience awareness. Because audience awareness is often something that I find students struggle with because they tend to envision a general audience, and they tend to envision an audience who is, when they envision a general audience, they envision an audience who is much like themselves. So rather than thinking about the specific characteristics of their audience, they think about what are some general rhetorical techniques, which is not as effective for shaping rhetoric for a particular audience. Now, you can, of course, do this in different ways. It doesn't necessarily need to be a profile of their fellow students. I've found that works really well because that's an audience they tend to have a sense of, but you can do this in other ways as well. I've done a variation of this, for instance, where we analyzed readers of the New York Times. So what are the characteristics of a typical New York Times reader? What are their values, or what do they think is important? And what kinds of rhetorical techniques or references would be persuasive for them? We did that, and actually we did that specifically in the context of, we read an article that was published in the New York Times, and then we did that audience analysis to try and figure out what that writer did specifically to appeal to the needs, values, characteristics, etc., etc., of a New York Times audience specifically. And so that really helps students chart their audience, chart the characteristics of their audience, and as they practice doing that, it becomes more and more intuitive. So the goal eventually is that you wouldn't have to write out the answers to these questions. You wouldn't have to make these charts because you develop a sense for reading your audience.